Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. The resignation of Keir Starmer in the UK is just making me be a little reflective on a lot of stuff that's been happening both in Canada and from what I know of the UK political situation. And part of that's because this earlier this year I read this book, How Westminster Works and Why It Doesn't. And it's kind of a cynical portrayal of the modern state of the British political system. But there's some really interesting insights in there as well, which I think we should kind of think about in Canada in our own context, given some of the similar situations that we find ourselves in, particularly around how our system works or mirrors closely the UK system with a few differences. But one of the things that really kind of stood out for me in the book was the notion that cabinet ministers have like a 2-year shelf life in their portfolio, usually finance ministers accepted, but and how that kind of shapes decision making, and particularly in a context where these ministers are looking to make a mark for themselves, and to have an impact on their legacy, and so on. And that somewhat applies in Canada as well, because we often will have ministers for a year or two as well, before they get shuffled off into different portfolios in or out of cabinet or what have you. But the notion that this particular sort of short-termism tends to bring when it comes to what ministers want to do, I think is an important lesson that we should be cognizant of. And we don't have as much, I would say, in Canada of a freelancing for ministers who want to find a project that will kind of put their stamp on things. I don't see that happening here nearly as much as is described over there, in particular because so much of our power is so much more centralized in PMO, and PMO often will issue directives or to ministers for what the mandates are, the infamous mandate letters, in terms of what PMO expects them to do, and what programs they expect them to advance, what legislation they expect them to draft and present, that kind of thing. So we don't get quite as much of that freelancing and trying to build particular legacies for themselves in those portfolios. But at the same time, I think it's also worth noting that what that short-termism does to the system in which we don't do enough long-term planning, and we don't do enough to see things through after we've done the announcements and so on. This was particularly bad in the Trudeau era, where the announcement is the policy and the follow-through was really difficult to locate in some cases, whether or not it actually happened, before they'd moved on to another shiny thing. And I think that's something that's necessarily important for people to follow up on, and to think about how government thinks about its programs and policies in terms of what it's looking to do. And that's, I guess, one of the things why I'm concerned about some of the ways in which Carney's moving, because everything again seems so focused on the short term. We need to build. Yes, okay, but what are we sacrificing in order to build, in the manner in which they're looking to do? And so much of that is resting on things like the environment, and climate change, and some of the work that's been done around Indigenous reconciliation is threatened to be walked back because they want to do things in a particular way, which may not be how things work anymore. But that's kind of where those are going. Another thing from the book that I thought was particularly noteworthy was how their particular civil service has so focused on people with general skills and not enough on people with specific subject matter expertise on their files, that it's created a situation where it's hard to implement things because you don't have enough people who have enough expertise to know how to make it work properly or not, and who could provide better advice, particularly when there are program ideas from a minister that are unworkable. And the book's got a couple of really strong examples around that. And I think this is something that we need to be aware of in Canada, because where we used to have a civil service that was full of subject matter experts, it's become less so over time, because the only way to advance is now to keep moving to different departments so that you don't build up enough expertise in particular subject areas, because you're constantly moving is the only way to advance your career and move up the ladder in that regard. So I think that's a good caution that we should beware of in terms of what has been happening in the UK, that we should take that lesson from. But I think it's also one of these things that coming out of the Trudeau era, we're starting to see some particular warning signs as well about, it's not only just the things that weren't followed up on, it was also the fact that I don't think there was enough supervision of what was happening within some of the departments. Because implementation was not only shoddy in some cases, but also there just wasn't enough rigor being applied in terms of how things were being implemented, and stuff was just kind of going through. I think immigration is a really important example of how a program was able to I'm not going to say go off the rails, because I don't think it's quite as dire as so many of the alarmists would think, but there were particular gaps that were not being addressed by the civil service side that should have been looked at, should have been better understood, should have been better managed. And I think that's one of the things that, coming out of the Trudeau era, I'm noticing patterns where you have issues in certain departments where it was simply that they weren't being managed well enough in terms of doing the proper work in their files. And I'm not saying ministers need to micromanage and be in every particular department, but there needs to be, I think, some better management, some better oversight. And I think the Trudeau government was particularly lax on that. And that's one of the things that I'm just kind of noticing. So I don't know how much of this is anecdotal, how much of this is more widespread, or if it's just particular examples that are kind of coming to my attention that may be atypical. But again, these are things that we don't get to hear a lot about because we don't have a robust enough media any longer who's really riding along with some of these departments and having enough subject matter experts within the media itself as well to know what's going on within departments and so on. So I think that's another dynamic that we should really be aware of. Looking in terms of how things are playing out. And so anyway, these were a few things I've been thinking about just in terms of how this whole week has been playing out. I have a column on Loony Politics right now about some of the stuff around the leadership for Starmer and how that differs from Canada, and I'll link that into the description below. But again, I just wanted to take a few minutes, just reflect on some of how what we're seeing over there reflects over what we're seeing here. And hopefully we can draw some lessons and try and avoid some of the problems that they've had. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter and journodale no_ on Bluesky. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.